Hello and welcome to Storytime with Mr. Laws. Today we're reading Fintan Fedora, the World's Worst Explorer by Clive Goddard. Chapter 20. By the time they'd covered their first 5 miles of river, Fintan's paddling had improved considerably. He was hitting the back of Gribley's head with his oar a lot less often. Progress had been erratic and at times frightening, but somehow, with the help of the current, they had stayed on course and not got lost at all. Daylight was fading fast, and Fintan was fading even faster. Ironically, just as he actually seemed to have got the hang of paddling, they reached the landmark Anna had told them to look out for, and had to stop. On their left-hand side was a steep bank of pinkish rock split by a spectacular waterfall where a separate river tributary flowed into theirs. Anna had made it very clear that they should abandon the boat here before the two rivers merged and to keep well clear of the resulting dangerous waters. Luckily, Gribley had remembered this important piece of information and steered them to the right side where they managed to drag the boat up the shallow, muddy bank. Unused to such hard physical work, they hauled their heavy packs on the boat and set up their first proper jungle camp with aching arms. Rather than a tent, they had brought hammocks, which could be suspended between trees and covered with mosquito nets. Once these were ready, they sat exhausted on an old mossy log and planned their evening meal. This meant gathering dry wood for a fire and finding a temporary home for the peanut butter sandwich collection so they could use the cooking pot. Gribley, being well skilled in the culinary arts, was able to produce a surprisingly good stew from the dried ingredients he'd brought along, and the cup of hot tea he made next was the best thing they'd tasted in days. After a quick clean-up, Fintan restocked and resealed the pot, then produced a length of rope from his rucksack. Gribley watched, intrigued, as he threw the rope over a tree branch, tied one end to the handle of the iron cooking pot, and began hauling it several feet into the air. "May I ask what you're doing, Master Fintan?" inquired Gribley. Fintan grinned, proud of his advanced jungle survival knowledge. "Ah, it's something I read about in Young Adventurer," he said. "All the famous jungle explorers do this. You're supposed to hang your food up a tree so that animals can't get to it." "I'm fairly sure they couldn't get to it anyway, sir," observed Gribley. "It is secured inside a strong iron pot with a fixed lid, after all." "Oh, can't be too sure, though. Some of these animals are pretty clever," said Fintan sagely, while attempting to tie the end of the rope to a tree trunk. "Please, be sure to tie a strong knot, sir. We wouldn't want it to fall, would we?" Fintan tutted at Gribley's obvious lack of faith in his practical ability. "Duh, of course I will," he said dismissively. "I used to be in the Cub Scouts, remember?" "Indeed, sir," said Gribley, "though if I remember correctly it was a rather brief membership. They were a little upset about that scout hut burning down." "Oh, relax, Gribbs. If there's one thing I'm good at, it's tying secure knots," said Fintan, with an air of finality. Unfortunately, his left bootlace was undone and trailing in the mud as he said it. By now, it was completely dark, and they were thoroughly worn out. There seemed little left to do but climb into their hammocks and go to sleep. A few hours later, dawn broke over the jungle. About half a mile west of Fintan's camp, Wrench's black executive helicopter was hovering noisily above the canopy, thrashing the treetops with the down blast from its rotors. According to his data, they were directly over the map coordinates of his planned dropping point. The rainforest was, of course, far too dense to allow landing, so he was carefully winched down to the forest floor, followed by his rucksack full of fantastically expensive technical equipment. Once safely on the ground, he signalled for the pilot to depart and immediately checked his tracking gear. A little red light was blinking on and off and making a satisfying beep noise. The tiny device Gonzales had planted in Fintan's rucksack appeared to be working perfectly, and indicating that young Master Fedora was, as expected, very close by. So close by, in fact, that his nice lion had been ruined. "Did you hear that, Gribbs?" he said from the depths of his sleeping bag. "Sounded like a helicopter." "Indeed I did, sir," replied Gribley, who was already up and preparing breakfast. Rather unusual to hear one this deep into the rainforest, I imagine. After a good bowl of porridge and a nice mug of tea, Gribbly and Fintan dismantled their camp and packed their damp, sweaty gear into their rucksacks. It was only an hour or so after dawn and already stiflingly hot, so they made sure they had plenty of drinking water handy. Gribbly had, of course, had the sense to bring a compass, so after consulting Anna's map, he was able to work out roughly which direction to walk in. "Oh, when's it going to be my turn to have the map?" asked Fintan eagerly. "I want to be group leader today, please." Reluctantly, Gribbly handed over the vital scrap of paper, but kept the compass and made a mental note to be involved in any navigation decisions. With their heavy loads hoisted onto their backs, they set off into the thick tangle of jungle. A few hundred yards away, Wrench noticed the little red light begin to move on his tracking screen. Things were going perfectly to plan. The idiot boy was going to lead him straight to the legendary Chocoplum Grove. Quickly, he grabbed his super lightweight high-tech equipment and followed from a safe distance. Walking through rainforest terrain isn't easy. The ground underfoot is uneven, strewn with fallen branches and roots that can trip the unwary. It can quickly change from slippery leaf cover to squelchy, ankle-deep mud. It involves struggling up steep, treacherous slopes and slithering down rock gullies. As if this isn't bad enough, the trees can be covered in nasty, sharp spikes and an assortment of vicious, poisonous leaves. There are things crawling around in the trees too, which are only too happy to bite, nibble and sting any warm-blooded creature that walks by. There are snakes and mosquitoes and scorpions and leeches, and even the possibility of the odd hungry jaguar. On top of all this, though, is the heat. A dull, heavy, energy-sapping, humid heat that sits on you and weighs you down like a soggy duvet. "Don't forget to keep drinking your water, sir. You mustn't get dehydrated," said Gribbly, at regular intervals during the day, prompted by Fintan's prolonged bouts of silence and occasional stumble. "Oh, I'm fine, thanks," insisted Fintan, despite feeling thoroughly exhausted. "Can we just stop here a minute, though, and have another look at the map?" It was the third time they'd stopped and checked the map in the last 2 hours, and each time there had been a disagreement followed by a change of direction. This time didn't look any different. "Actually, Gribbs, I reckon you were right last time. We should have gone left, not straight on," said Fintan, still a little confused as to how the compass worked. "Sorry about that. You probably shouldn't listen to my suggestions. I'm usually wrong." Ever patient and tolerant, Gribbly resisted the urge to say, "I told you so," but agreed that they should turn around, retrace their path, and then follow the new course. Staring at his bleeping device, Wrench noted this new change of direction with alarm. The chaotic, zigzagging route they'd been taking could mean only one thing. They must have worked out they were being followed and were trying to shake him off. Cursing this bit of bad luck, he turned to follow them and shrieked in terror as he came face to face with a wild-looking apparition. There was a tall, dark man with incredibly messy, matted hair staring directly at him. His face was scratched and blotchy and covered in what looked like little teeth marks. Weirder still, he was wearing a pair of half-melted sunglasses and had the tufty remains of a false ginger beard glued to his face in little patches. Wrench fumbled for his gun and pointed it shakily at the terrifying wild man. "Stay back," he stammered, his voice squeaky with fear. "I'm armed, see?" Much to his surprise, the man began pointing at the Giganti Foods International logo emblazoned across Wrench's jacket. "Don't shoot," he said with a strong Brazilian accent. "I am on your side." He reached into his ragged trouser pocket, produced the Giganti Foods International identity card, and held it up for inspection. "Gonzalez?" said Wrench, when he'd recovered from the sudden shock. The wreck of a man nodded. "But I thought you were dead." For the next few minutes, Gonzalez explained his long, unfortunate story, right up to the point where he'd been swept into the dangerous waters beneath the waterfall and pummeled around like a load of washing on a spin cycle. It had been a painful battering, but had at least shaken off the last of the piranhas. He was also able to report the good news that Fintan didn't appear to be armed. However, it was the news that the boy was in possession of a map that Wrench found most exciting. "What?" he exclaimed. "A map?
To the fruit trees? And no gun? Why didn't you say so before?
Gonzales shrugged. How could I? He said. He threw my walkie-talkie out the bus. This was fantastic news for Wrench. It meant he didn't have to trudge around following in the idiot kid's meandering footsteps anymore. All he had to do was walk straight up to him and take the map. An image of taking candy from a baby popped into his head. The rules of the game had just changed in his favour. Chapter 21. Darkness falls quickly in the jungle. Fintan and Gribbly hadn't gone much further when they were forced to stop and prepare for their second night in the wild. They tied their hammocks again, built a small fire, and ate another stew. Exhausted by the day's endeavours, they were ready to sleep soon after. Fintan hoisted their food supplies aloft again, tied another wobbly knot, and changed into his special jungle pyjamas, which he'd chosen because they had little pictures of explorers in pith helmets all over them. "Sleep well, sir," said Gribbly, having carefully removed a few nasty-looking bugs from his sleeping bag. "Good night, Gribbs," replied Fintan. There was a short pause before he decided this might be a good time to get something off his chest. "Actually, I've been thinking," he said. "Really, sir?" replied Gribbly, unused to this sort of thing. "What about?" "About you calling me sir all the time, Gribbs. I mean, we're not at home now, are we? We're miles from home in the middle of nowhere. You shouldn't have to call me sir here, should you?" Gribbly was surprised. It was such a habit that he didn't even realise he was doing it. I hadn't realised it might be an issue, sir," he said, demonstrating his point. "You must know what I mean, though," added Fintan. "We're on an expedition together. We're fellow explorers. Can't we just talk to each other like, mates or something, like we're out here?" "Well, I shall try, of course, if that's what you wish," said Gribbly, making a conscious effort not to add sir. "But I think I might find that a little difficult to maintain. You must bear in mind that we're not actually friends at all. I am an employee of your family, and I'm here in that capacity. Remember, your father is paying me to escort you on this journey." Even though this was all quite true, Gribbly felt he was perhaps being a little unfair. Their relationship wasn't one of friends or equals as such, but they had known each other for years, and there was definitely an element of friendship between them. The boy meant well. It wasn't his fault he was such a disaster. "Suppose so," said Fintan, sounding a bit hurt and disappointed. Gribbly, feeling a bit guilty, was just about to concede that he would definitely try to cut down on the sir front when he was distracted by something crawling along his arm. He leapt up within the narrow confines of his mosquito net and brushed something scaly off into the darkness. "What was that?" said Fintan, switching on his head torch in alarm. I'm not sure, sir. Master Fintan. Possibly a scorpion." Gribbly also found his torch and searched around in his hammock for the intruder, randomly smacking at things with a shoe. Still a little upset by their conversation, Fintan decided he needn't approve of this callous behaviour. "There's no need to kill it, Gribbs," he protested sulkily. "Leave that poor thing alone." "But they carry quite an unpleasant sting," stammered Gribbly, amazed at Fintan's sudden conversion to animal rights. "Yeah, but that doesn't mean you have to kill it, does it?" said Fintan, climbing down from his hammock. "It's just looking for somewhere cosy to sleep, same as you and me. Give it to me, Gribbs, and I'll put it somewhere safe." Still not convinced by this sudden concern for all the forest's poor innocent things, Gribbly conducted a thorough but slightly less violent search of his sleeping area. It was indeed a scorpion, a really big one too, and it wasn't alone. It appeared he'd been sharing his sleeping bag with a whole family of them, and a pair of big hairy black tarantulas who had joined them for good measure. "Poor things," said Fintan, without much obvious conviction. "Come here, I won't let the mean man hurt you." Having wrapped the poor little innocent creatures in a vest, he pottered away into the trees. "Master Fintan, sir," called Gribbly, "it's very unwise to leave the camp in the dark, sir. You might get lost." "Oh, stop worrying, will you?" replied Fintan crossly. "I've got my head torch on, and I'm not going far." Amazingly, he was back within a couple of minutes, without his poisonous little friends, and without having got lost, being attacked by something or fallen into something nasty. "Right," he announced, climbing back into his hammock and sleeping bag. "Maybe now we can get some kip." Gribbly agreed and wished him good night again. He knew Fintan wouldn't be sulking for long. He never did. And even if Gribbly was a family employee, he would also make more of an effort not to call Fintan Sir quite so often. As jobs went, this wasn't a bad one. If anything, it was a surprisingly strange and occasionally exciting one. And he had to admit that although life with Fintan was unpredictable, perilous and chaotic, this was certainly never dull. "Just out of interest," said Gribbly, "did you find somewhere to put the creatures?" "I did," announced Fintan proudly. "I hadn't gone all that far, and I found a pair of old boots lying on the ground. So I put them inside. Bit of luck, eh?" First thing the following morning, they were both shocked awake by a blood-curdling scream which echoed through the forest. It sounded really close by, too. It seemed remarkably unlikely out here in the middle of nowhere, but Gribbly couldn't help wondering whether those old boots had belonged to someone after all. I'll see you tomorrow for a couple more chapters.